Those of you who work as language translators, what is the most awkward, uncomfortable conversation that you have had to convey? My elderly parents spoke English very poorly, and I often translated for them. After my father passed away, I took my mother to the Social Security office to take care of paperwork. One of the questions they asked was whether there were any other potential beneficiaries of my father's benefits, such as other children or ex-wives. Being an only child, I immediately answered no. My mother asked me what the question was. I interpreted with my answer. She looked at me sheepishly and answered, "That's not exactly correct." It was then, at the age of 50 in the Social Security building, that I learned that my father had previously been married and had had a child. Mother and baby died during childbirth. Story 2. Okay, so my parents are divorced and my dad is deaf. He's not the brightest fellow, so I sort of manage his medical stuff for him when his parents passed away. Now, typically I'd book a sign language interpreter for medical appointments so I can just take notes and ask questions. But this time I didn't bother, figured I could just interpret. Now Dad had a new girlfriend, and I had the joy of interpreting my father's struggles with erectile dysfunction. See, his new girlfriend, who was 10 years younger, was looking for more frequent performances than Dad could muster. So we got in depth about how frequently was appropriate for man in his late 50s, and then had to discuss the risks of erections going on too long with Viagra. Yeah, I always book an interpreter now. And no, I never did figure out the correct sign for erection. Story 3. I work tech support and often have to use a language line. My favorites are Asian languages and when people are pissed. The interpreters, bless their hearts, will faithfully translate, but every so often will say, they are saying not kind things about you personally. Story 4. My cousin is a sign language interpreter, and he says a big problem he and his clients have is that people talk to him rather than the client. Even at really important things like doctor appointments, the doctor will spend ages asking my cousin where he learned BSL while the deaf client just wants to get their medical issue looked at. It's against policy for my cousin to hold their own conversation with the doctor when he's working, as he's only there to help the client understand what people are saying. He and his clients find it really frustrating and rude. So basically, if you see someone with a sign language interpreter, you can literally just ignore the interpreter and everyone will prefer it that way, as they can just get on with their job. Also, one of his first ever clients saw his doctor was Indian and signed, "Where's my curry?" That was pretty awkward, especially when the doctor then asked what the sign meant. Story 5. I was interpreting for a high school teacher who was participating in an event to try to get dropouts to come back to HS in a majority Hispanic neighborhood. Anyway, the school gave us a list with addresses that we had to go to try to persuade the kids' parents. We go to this one house and ring the bell, the mother answers. I start translating what the teacher was saying, and we go back and forth with the mother, asking her to see the kid. Let's call her Maria. The mom kept insisting we couldn't talk to Maria, and the teacher kept giving the whole spiel about dropping out and to think of the future, etc. About 10 minutes into the conversation, the frustrated teacher wants me to ask the mother why on earth couldn't we talk to Maria, to which the mother breaks down crying and says that she died a week before from a long illness. That's why she had dropped out. Ensues the worst and most awkward, maybe 5 minutes of our lives, between apologies and condolences. Needless to say, we didn't go to any other house that day. School, turns out, was aware of the kid's passing, but had forgotten to take her out of the list. Story 6. I've been on multiple medical trips to Mexico with my urologist father. Bringing translators that have little to no medical experience is incredibly difficult, and in the OR, no one knows the different names for instruments. Differs between states/countries. I've sat in on multiple appointments and surgeries with translators, and by far the worst is when my dad makes the usually very religious translators talk about sexual health. In addition, oftentimes people only speak Mayan in this particular village, so there has to be an English to Spanish translator and a Spanish to Mayan translator. Story 7. I wasn't a translator, but I worked at a place that captioned telephone calls for customers who were hard of hearing. We only heard one side of the phone call, then basically repeated what we heard into our voice recognition software, and then corrected it on the fly. Most of the conversation were boring old people talking to other old people, 50 people in a row calling in to vote for Dancing with the Stars. But ever so rarely you get a good one. Mine was what I'm assuming was a deaf young lady and her boyfriend, because the conversation very quickly turned from "how are you doing" to "I wanted to tie you spread eagle on the bed and lick you all over." This continued for about 15 minutes, but the best part is all the cubicles around you hearing you loudly and very clearly speak, so the voice recognition doesn't duck up. Graphic, depraved sex acts while they are trying not to lose their crap laughing and still keep up captioning an old lady's cookies recipe. Story 8. I was a conversation teacher for adults in Japan who wanted to practice more natural English. Not strict formal grammar, but conversational. Not quite an interpreter, but one student was an 80-year-old man the others called Mr. Dictionary, because his vocab was seriously exhaustive. There were very few words that could stump him, usually some type of slang. On the rare occasion he brought a printout to ask about a new word, I would get both excited and nervous to see what it was. This was in 2007. One day, he pulls out a paper and says, "I heard a news story about a scandal with an American radio host insulting some athletes. Please tell me, what does this mean?" And with all eyes in the class waiting for my wise translation, he loudly and carefully pronounced, "Nappy-headed escorts." Story 9. I'm a translator, which means I only work with the written word, not normally anything particularly juicy. However, I once had to deal with a landlord writing to Facebook to try and get Facebook to take down derogatory comments from his tenants. Basically, the landlord was accused of giving apartments to people who would sleep with him. So I had to translate a whole bunch of comments calling him a horn dog, saying the whole tower block had been under his desk, etc. Someone called him the little version of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, which I thought was pretty hilarious. I actually did once have to interpret between a woman having a stroke and a first aider, not as a professional interpreter. Just happened to be there and speak her language. I did okay at getting her info and keeping her calm waiting for the ambulance. But then the paramedics wanted me to tell her that she was probably having a stroke and I couldn't remember the word. So I said she was having a brain attack. Story 10. This may not be awkward, uncomfortable per se, but I once worked for an American teacher in Taiwan who expected his interpreters to be able to translate puns into another language. He did not or would not understand that a pun in English isn't a pun in Chinese. Story 11. There are a few. One of the worst is having to relay bad news like cancer diagnosis, especially when the doctor is extremely blunt or hurried. As an interpreter, you cringe and wish you could change even just the tone or the insensitive wording to make it sound more humane. But you really shouldn't, because as an interpreter, your job is to relay the info as closely as possible. Another difficult situation is when you're called to a patient that is coding. This was especially difficult when I worked with pediatric patients at the children's hospital and trying to calm down the frantic parents. Another one is being called to the ER and then upon arriving, finding out it's a person I know outside of work, like a family friend. In that situation, I would try to get someone else to interpret because of ethics. But it's still a tough situation because you want to help as much as you can while you wait on someone else to take over. I honestly could go on, but these are usually the exceptions, as I love my job. There's just some days that are more difficult than others. Story 12. My most awkward/uncomfortable moment by far was when I had to interpret for an Iraqi national who was briefly detained by the British Army in the early years of the war and was seeking compensation for it. The poor guy had Bren rounded up with a bunch of friends/co-workers, beaten senselessly, and abused more than once. That was a rather painful conversation. Story 13. Most uncomfortable for me was interpreting at a mental health facility. And a patient walked over to the payphone in the day room, sat down, grabbed the phone, and wrapped it around his neck before pushing his chair out from under himself. Most uncomfortable for other people in the audience was interpreting a sex education curriculum training for teachers. I was in heaven because it's not often I get to use all the sex-relate signs, but it was funny to see so many adults who were so embarrassed by talking about sex. Also sad that they would be taking that shame, embarrassment, back to the classroom. Story 14. Similar to others, not an actual translator, but my parents spoke poor English when I was younger. When I was 12, they filed for bankruptcy and took me to the lawyer's office to translate for them. Having them go through and tell me everything they blew money on was extremely uncomfortable. Now, as an adult, they get offended when I don't want to take financial advice from them. Story 15. I was interpreting for an elementary-age deaf girl. She was having trouble understanding an issue at school, and some of the other students started mocking her. I had to interpret their insults to her. I felt absolutely torn apart by that. Story 16. I was a Spanish medical translator for a while, and there were some pretty bad ones, but one really stands out above the rest. I followed a nurse into a room where the patient was waiting. Now, I know nothing about the patient. I'm only there to translate what the nurse says. So when the nurse says, "You're pregnant," I gave a huge smile and went, "Estás embarazada?" Patient stares in shock for a second, and then bursts into tears. The nurse stammers a bit, and then goes, "No bueno." The news we had to give was bad enough, but the fact that I thought it was supposed to be a happy announcement made it 10x more cringe. Story 17. Not the interpreter and not deaf, but I attended a comedy performance that had a female interpreter on stage with the comedian. For context, the interpreter was provided by the university, and it was the comedian's first experience being interpreted. He decided to make jokes about the situation, including, at one point, wondering aloud how the word bra would be signed, and watching the interpreter for the answer. She got to the important word and decided to fingerspell. I was highly amused. Story 18. I'm an immigration officer who works with inadmissible aliens, people who are not authorized to enter the country for reasons like criminal records, ties to terrorism, or previous immigration violation. I've put so many translators in so many uncomfortable positions over the years. Two that come to mind. I was working with some ethnic Albanians who we caught red-handed trying to cross illegally, and I was laying out the government's case and explaining the next steps to them. They weren't breaking, a term we use to describe a guilty person's admission of guilt, despite overwhelming evidence. I was trying to break them via the translator, so the translator had to match my accusatory tone. Once they broke, got charged, and I finished up the paperwork. The Albanians left the room and I was chatting with the translator. We call them, they translate over the phone. And they told me they went to high school with these guys. Long story short, that particular accent was centered in a small town. And as soon as these guys started talking, the translator knew they were from her hometown. Throughout the course of the call, they have to state their full name and job. She said afterwards she knew the whole family, but they likely have no idea who she is. Crazy small world. Second story. I found CP on this scumbag's phone, and he all of a sudden couldn't speak any English. So I dragged him into an interview room and called the translation service for Greek. The dude had been living in Canada for 20 years. There's no way he didn't speak English, but some people get desperate when cornered. I had reviewed the data on his phone and several dirty photos, and I wanted to get some more information out of him to see if I could determine the nature of the relationship, the location, and the names of anyone else involved for investigative purposes. Throughout the course of the interview, the dude started to break down, and the normally strict, regimented question, answer method halted abruptly. He began this semi-rehearsed monologue about how he had been in love with Guy, how he took him from his home and locked him in the basement with the hopes that the guy would one day love him, all in Greek. The poor translator, who I'm sure was furiously typing while translating to keep it all straight so he could refer it back to me, had to listen to a 10-minute-long murder confession, including some gruesome details about how the guy had died, then had to relay it back to me in English so I could process it as well. Neither of us, myself or the translator, had signed up for that crap. Story 19. I'm an interpreter for a school district working mostly with high schoolers. The most uncomfortable conversation I've ever had to interpret for was teaching a room full of high school boys sex education. I am young and somewhat close to their age, which didn't help at all. Explaining stis, how to use condoms, body parts, etc. to 16-year-old boys is definitely not the most fun thing to do. I find conversations to be awkward when the English speaker completely ignores Westcourt, for I am interpreting for and just talks to me and looks at me the whole time. Like I am not the one here who is having the conversation with you. Please treat them like you would any other person you are talking to. Story 20. Not a translator, but I used their assistance all the time at the hospital. The worst was telling a family their loved one just died, then having to wait like 10 seconds for the interpreter to say it. Then the family is distraught and crying and asking questions, and you have to slowly interpret everything back and forth. Story 21. This is a different sort of uncomfortable than it seems like you're asking about but duck it, might as well share. My career as a translator was neither brilliant, not comfortable, and I'm very glad it's over. My last job as a translator was on a book about some new age topic that was pretty ridiculous to begin with. It was also my first big job as a translator, and I made rather poor decisions. One of which was agreeing that my payment for the book would be a percentage of the sales and nothing else. It was a good percentage IRC, but still a dumb idea. I had to pretend to be into the new age thing too, which wasn't too hard as I knew someone else who was involved. But really, I just wanted to be able to put a book on my resume. I get to work, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, but my enthusiasm doesn't last long because this woman was making me translate not an original manuscript, but a translation of the original, which she had written Dutch, and then translated herself into English. Now, I don't know if she was any good as an author, but I can tell you she was a god-awful translator. You can't just fancy yourself a translator because you're pretty good at another language. And yet this is exactly what she had done. There were whole passages that felt as though she had simply put them through Google Translate that I had to physically copy out and parse, like I do for Latin, in order to understand them. It was the most headache-inducing thing I've ever, including my present course of study in medieval languages. But the worst thing was that once I had finished, sent the thing off, and thanked my stars that I had nothing more to do other than await my percentage of the sales. The New Age type organization she had written the book for, of her own initiative, decided that they didn't want it published, expelled her from their ranks, and forbade any version of the book from ever being mentioned ever again. I translated 260 pages of nonsense for literally nothing. Another time I accepted a job translating a friend of a friend's poems. They were not good poems. In fact, they were really, really bad poems. And it was really hard to stop myself from subtly making the English versions just a tiny bit less cringy. I think she noticed because she got a friend of hers to reread my work, do her own translation, and ultimately she told me that since I had done half the work, I'd get half the pay, which sucked. But I gladly accepted because it sucked less than working on her crap poetry. Story 22. Not me, but my grandfather's translator. A little backstory for you. Gramps, on Dad's side, didn't speak much English. Gran, on Mom's side, had been inserting herself into both of her daughters' marriages. In the past, she caused one unlucky fellow, my aunt, her daughter, married to have a bad run-in with the police. She continued to insert herself into my aunt's other marriage. Aunt was murdered by her husband. Details are fuzzy for me, but it may have had something to do with something Gran said to initiate it. Aunt and her second husband were fighting at their house alone afterwards. This story takes place when my parents and grandparents, both sides, were at a Children's Protective Services, CPS meeting. So my parents, my grandparents, the caseworker, a translator, and I think another CPS employee were in a room discussing the next steps to help my mom to stop drinking and provide a better home environment for us kids. Some words were thrown by my mom's lunatic mother who was hollering about whatever, blaming my dad for this and his parents for that and how she misses her deceased daughter, so she's very emotional. My Gramps turned to the translator and said something in Italian. Gramps' wife and my dad understand and are surprised. The translator? To the core. The translator was shocked. Face was white. And he insisted he couldn't repeat what Gramps just said. Gramps insisted. Translator refused. Gramps said, "Say it, or I'll get someone else to." The translator refused again. Gramps turned to Gran, pointed a finger and shook it at her and declared, "You're the reason your daughter is dead." Gran lost it, ranted and raved and hollered to the point where she got kicked out of the meeting. CPS then told my parents they needed to divorce. Story 23. I'm not a translator, but I work in China and speak passable Mandarin. I once got a call from a Chinese friend saying that her friend, also Chinese, was on honeymoon in Hawaii and needed my help translating as she didn't speak any English. The husband had gone out for a swim and never returned, and the wife was having trouble communicating this to the police. I communicated the problem and then spent a while looking for local Chinese societies that could possibly help out. But it was gone midnight and I couldn't get hold of anyone. She was totally hysterical, so I managed to get a hotel worker to stay with her, even though she didn't speak any Mandarin. The worst part came about an hour later when the wife called me and put me on the phone with a police officer who was asking her to go to identify a body, which turned out to be her husband's. I told her and the officer through the whole process and listened to the whole thing. Fortunately, a member of one of the Chinese societies in the area got in touch in the morning and took over from me, no doubt helping a lot more than I could. My Mandarin, whilst functional, wouldn't have sounded very sympathetic, and no doubt he was much more able to comfort the poor lady. Despite my Mandarin not being good enough for the situation, we got through it. It was less awkward and more tragic, however. Story 24. I'm a bilingual rep for a company, so for the most part, I have to deal with whatever crap the customer dishes out myself. For example, I had one customer who told me that he was sincerely disappointed, as in pissed, with my customer service because the other girl who supports the language and I were non-native speakers, and he wanted a real native to support him. Basically, it was a case of, sorry, bro. However, the most awkward moment so far happened today, and it was between a French customer and my translator. I know enough French to be dangerous, so I could understand enough of the conversation between them, which basically boiled down to them calling each other idiots because the customer thought that the translator told me the wrong spelling of his name. They were actually fighting while I'm sitting there as the third party, thinking to myself, should I break it up? I decided the best course of action was to not employ my rusty French, could have made things worse, and browse other open cases while they worked it out. Story 25. I used to work in forensic psych. The staff office was on the floor, and it had to be kept locked if nobody was in there, so the patients couldn't come in and take things to make weapons. So one evening, I worked swing. There was an ASL-trained social worker in the office talking to a deaf patient. The tech was in there with them, doing some work while they sat in the corner. Eventually, the tech got up and left the office, locking it behind him and leaving the female SW locked up with a male forensic psych patient. Eventually, I got a call from a very upset SW, demanding to know why she had been locked in the office with a potentially violent patient. I went to find the tech to find out what happened. He said they were off in the corner, not speaking, and he just forgot they were there and left. Story 26. I'm not a translator, but my late Sil had her voice box removed and some horrendously drastic brain and maxillofacial surgery, which left her with a very shrunken, deformed, and scarred mouth and nose to try to get rid of a very rare and aggressive disease. I can lip read, so I used to be the one who dealt with official things and doctors, etc. One night, her hubby and Bill were sitting telling her all the local gossip, and out of the blue, she asked him a question. My heart sank. Do you still love me? He looked at me and asked what she said, so I repeated it for him, and he took hold of her hands and told her he had always loved her and would always love her. Even like this, looking like this, she gestured to her face. And he confirmed that he always would love her and that she was beautiful. Will you marry somebody else after I'm dead? No, of course. I won't be said. Will you pick out my favorite songs? I really like my girl, and make sure they put me in my purple dress. I can't tell you what he replied to that because I had to leave the ward. I cried for about an hour. She passed away 5 days later, and 16 years later, I still cry thinking about that conversation. Story 27. Translator here. Probably the time when I had to explain to a patient that she had an infection. I had to stand next to her and watch her fully naked. Oh, and also in a meeting between a governor, a ministry, officials, and a Chinese company where I was working as an interpreter and the words started mixing up. And I went full blank mode and started stuttering and just stood there for a while. Somehow I managed to work it out. Story 28, working as a manager on a Tokyo-Sydney flight, and as the only Japanese speaker on the crew, had to translate for an Aussie doctor who came forward to assist. When we found one of our Japanese packs unconscious on the bathroom floor, turned into a very weird situation, very quickly. The patient passenger in question was a newlywed Japanese lady who couldn't speak for herself due to the whole unconscious thing. But her new husband was very concerned that sex the night before might be the problem. He wanted me to translate to the DR in very detailed and specific language exactly what his concerns were. His knowledge of her type 1, insulin-dependent diabetes was apparently non-existent. He didn't mention it at all when we asked about pre-existing conditions or medications she might be taking. Just kept talking about their sex experience the night before. How big his hard-on was, how she reacted, whether she liked it. He thought she had, but now wasn't sure. Weirdest situation ever. Luckily, we found her blood glucose testing kit in the seat pocket at her seat, and were able to work out what had happened. Turns out she was having a serious but easily managed hypoglycemic episode. She hadn't eaten for over 24 hours, but still took usual amounts of insulin, hoping to lose weight before her planned photos in bikini at Aussie beaches. She recovered quickly after treatment, but he still kept insisting that he was sure the sex played a part. It was like the dude had some serious fixation on it. We weren't sure whether he was bragging or genuinely concerned. He was just so weird about it. Even when she had recovered and was able to communicate for herself that it had nothing to do with her current situation. In embarrassment, she moved seats to another section of the plane and wouldn't let him sit with her. She refused to speak with him at all, and then she bolted from the plane without him after landing. We later saw him still searching for her at the baggage carousel. She'd apparently already picked up her bag and left. Can only imagine how the rest of that honeymoon played out. Story 29. My family used to have a boot store located at Traders Village out here in Dallas. Our next-door neighbor, a Mexican woman well into her 80 AS, had a shop where she sold all kinds of things. Bicycles, toys, old books, etc. One day, a 13-year-old me is minding his own business helping clean up our store when my mom tells me to go see what all is going on with the next-door neighbor since she heard people raise their voices. I reluctantly go over there and per my mom's orders. I ask if everything is okay or if I can somehow help. The situation was this. Our neighbor, an older woman who I thought didn't speak a word of English, sold the parents of a rather hefty kid a bicycle earlier that day. The bicycle apparently went kaput almost immediately after this beefy boy started to ride around on it. The parents came in to complain that our neighbor had sold them a bicycle she knew to be junk, and they wanted their money back. This is more or less where I come in. When I show up asking if I could help, in English, the parents immediately started using me as their interpreter and demanded that I tell our neighbor that they want their money back or they'll call police and see what they make of it. My neighbor then turns to the parents and starts talking and says that she can't be blamed for that fat-ass kid being too big for a bicycle. I think the parents caught at least a little of what she said, but they weren't sure what it was since she said it in Spanish, so they turned to me and asked me, demanded more like, if she blamed it on their kid's weight. At this point, I turned silent. The neighbor tells me to tell them exactly what she said, and the parents, who have pretty much figured out what she said, are just waiting for me to actually say it and confirm what they already knew. At this point, I tell the parents that I don't even work there and that I don't want any part of whatever is happening. The mom of the kid realizes what an uncomfortable situation I was in and apologized for the situation they brought me into. I went back to the My Parents store and I told my mom to never volunteer me for anything like that ever again. In the end, the parents ended up getting shafted since the lady had a all sales final sign, and there's really not much anyone can do that would be worth any more time and effort. I came to find out sometime later that our neighbor spoke English the whole time, but she found it much easier to pretend to only speak or understand a few words when dealing with people who don't speak Spanish. Story 30. My time has come. I used to work as a corporate personal interpreter for visiting executives. What the personal means is that my job didn't end with the workday. I would go around with these execs from morning to night, and sometimes through the night, depending on their plans, just interpreting, translating whatever they needed. This included any leisure activities. And wow, executives visiting Japan sure leap to wanting to find sex as soon as they can. They'd make sure I signed an NDA, and off we would head to a red light district. The most awkward situation I was in was with a drunk exec who wanted to have sex with the hostess of the club we were in. She was not a sex worker, She wasn't interested and was only humoring him, but I had to sit there for something like an hour as he started sweet-talking her and then moved on to outright blatantly sexual stuff. As she was dodging this, he was getting more and more angry and belligerent and started directing it at me because she would obviously, be falling all over him. A fat, sloppy 60-something exec with more of a resemblance to Trump than not, if he had a better interpreter. I should make it up to him by having sex with him instead. And then he decided to call up one of the company directors he had met with earlier in the day to yell at them, through me, about how awful an interpreter I was because they promised him I would make sure he didn't have to worry about any language barriers, but now I wouldn't sleep with him and wouldn't interpret well enough to get the other girl to. There were countless times I had to interpret execs talking dirty to girls, with them getting upset about it, but they usually didn't try to force me to have sex with them instead or make me call up the director to tell him I wouldn't. Story 31. Not me, but a dear friend was a refugee when she came to the U.S. fleeing the Bosnian genocide. She was brought into the interpretation business out of necessity, assisting fellow refugees with communication throughout the process of being granted asylum, finding apartments, entering the workforce, etc. Over time, she got all of her certifications. But just last year, she up and switched careers, quit her job, and matriculated as a full-time MA student in a completely different field in a city 2 hours away, and she commutes every day. About a month ago, she told me the real reason for this abrupt change in life trajectory. She'd been hired as the court interpreter for a fellow Bosnia refugee, one whom she'd known a long time, but whose story she wasn't familiar with. My friend was charged with listening to him regale his and his son's suffering before a judge, then translated into English for all to hear. She said that usually, her policy when helping fellow refugees in a courtroom setting was be a chair. She avoided emotional involvement out of her own necessity, but this case was too much for her. She saw it through, but immediately started hunting for a new job. Story 32. The company I work for has a Spanish translation team that I use very frequently and know all of them. We basically do customer service. The most awkward conversations is when you have an irate person on the other line that is cussing you out. Our translators are supposed to translate word for word unless vulgar language is used, then they can summarize. Basically, what I hear is about a minute of someone screaming at me, using multiple choice words that I can recognize as curse words, then the translator translating, essentially, they are not happy with your answer. It's awkward for everyone because the translator is basically getting yelled at and has nothing to do with anything other than he picked up that call. And I have to just sit there for minutes at a time listening to someone scream and a short 5-word translation. The customer usually catches on after the first tirade or two that there is no point and they should just calm down and be a decent human being and talk it out. Story 33. Not a translator, but my mom was a dispatcher for a translation agency for a while. Most awkward incident was when she had to explain to a woman why she couldn't get them an ASL translator over the phone. Story 34. I'm an ASL interpreter at Video Relay Call Center, and I have had to interpret plenty of uncomfortable conversations. But most recently, I had my first phone sex call. Story 35. A deaf middle schooler I was interpreting for was making the dirty sign and putting in front of their face and pretending to lick it, basically saying, "eat peas" in ASL. They saw me looking and stopped doing it, but otherwise I would have had to voice that in front of about 100 middle schoolers because there was no one else there who could understand ASL. Closest call I've ever had. A note for anyone worried about me not voicing. There were situational reasons for it because of the deaf child's IEP. In addition, children are often still learning how to use interpreters. So I would give them a chance to stop saying whatever they're saying before voicing it with no warning. Story 36. Different Spanish-speaking countries have vastly different definitions of concha, pendejo, malando, etc. You could be talking about a specific type of bread in one country and lady parts in another. Story 37. Had a mostly non-verbal individual who would sign, and I worked in her home as a home nursing aide. Cool chick who was pretty funny, but also very difficult to understand her handwriting. She loved that I could sign, and we would often use finger spelling and adapted sign. She had her own gestures like the letter C and make cat ears for cat. I would come in and she and I would have coffee and figure out our day using paper and pen and sign language. We had a really obnoxious staff who did not sign. He would speak to the client in baby talk and often misunderstand her writing. One morning he worked the overnight and I was coming in on day shift. My lady had the coffee on, paper and pen, and was waiting for me to chat it up. My staff was trying, too hard, to tell me all about his hard work the evening before. My patient just sat there the entire time he was talking to me, signing, "He is stupid. He does not listen to me. He is stupid. Big dummy," in broken sign and finger spelling. Hardest thing to not sit and laugh as this a whole was telling me about scrubbing the floors. She told me he fell asleep in the chair again overnight and he should be fired. I had to report it to the office manager, who also came over and could sign. It was hilarious and oh, so awkward. He was fired after he got a warning. I don't think he ever figured out that our patient was able to sign so well and was how we found out. Story 38. When I first became a RAN back in the early 90s, I heard of a case where a housekeeper was translating to a patient going to have surgery. The patient was a non-compliant diabetic that developed a diabetic foot ulcer that would not heal. The medical team tried to treat her wound, but would not heal due to the patient's non-compliance and uncontrolled diabetes. The patient was going septic, and the foot needed to be removed. The housekeeper was the one that was translating that her foot needs to be removed, but did not have the heart to tell that to the patient. She would say that they were just going to cut the ulcer off. The housekeeper could not bring it to herself to actually say that your whole foot was coming off, even though she understood completely what she was translating. Patient signs consent. Patient wakes up and freaks out that her foot was removed. This probably happened in the 80s. Now there are strict guidelines. We can only use global interpreters or hospital interpreters that went to a special class and passed the exam, which was hard for naive speakers of that language. No housekeepers, family members, or nursing staff cannot translate for specific surgeries or risky procedures. Story 39. I worked phone support for a cell company for some years, and for customers who don't speak English, we have an interpreter service. We basically conference the interpreter into the call and take turns speaking. Makes the call longer, but it gets the job done. One memorable call had my interpreter flustered as I had to explain to an Arabic man that he did not have insurance on his last phone and would need to pay full price for a replacement. I remember the interpreter's anxiousness at translating the rudeness very well. Interpreter. The customers say that he say that, oh my very goodness. He say you a very rude man. When I get really beside myself, I'll mutter, oh my very goodness. Story 40. Parents are deaf and am a sign language interpreter. I work for a certain video phone, think Skype, where the deaf people can see me. I make calls for them and I interpret said call company. And every now and then I will pick up night hours. Like nightlife, some of the strangest and most interesting calls come up. One evening, a deaf girl calls her hearing boyfriend. Must have been long distance based on phone numbers. And it starts as a normal convo. But after about 30 minutes of awkward small talk, the girl starts asking if he misses her. She misses him. She misses his smell, his manhood. It didn't go into a sex call. Now, I'm a male interpreter, and I'm trying not to lose it. At the same time, I feel bad for the git, because he has to listen to this guy with a deep voice telling him that, I miss how you feel inside me. Like a champ, he doesn't miss a beat and continues with the convo. Night call. Different day, really old deaf guy. Must be lonely and horny because he makes a call to Adam and Eve. Crap. I don't know what the protocol is. I know that the FCC regulates our call policy, like no 900 numbers or paid phone sex, for those not in the know. But I don't know about this one. So I humor the guy, and the dude goes on to order. I don't remember the real names, as this was a few years ago, but similar, I think. Ass Blasters, Muff Divers, and Daddy Bear. Again, not the name, but you get the idea. That last one threw me, but he was insistent that they had it and double-checked. They added it. My boss said that I should have politely explained that we do not make those calls. I wish I would have known sooner. Story 41. I translate for my job and my family as I happen to have the highest level of English. Family. In middle school, some of my family members were applying for green cards. There was a time when this was a huge fad in Asia. 13-year-old me was trying to wade through legalese and convert it to Chinese. My Chinese wasn't that good at the time, let's just say it was very painful, huh? The most awkward situation was when I had to write and then interpret conversations that my relatives didn't want their green cards anymore. Also another fad that swept Asia. Tough as nails. And how do you explain nicely to an American Gov employee that all these applicants no longer want to be part of our wonderful nation? Job. I now translate Chinese web fiction serials into English, and most of them are run-of-the-mill martial arts, palace drama, action and romance, etc. The overt sexism kills me sometimes, especially for novels with female protagonists. You get gems like, what could she, a woman, do in insert a million scenarios that have nothing to do with her gender? Or like a typical woman, or women and backstabbers are the two types of people to never associate with. Or, the absence of any knowledge is a woman's greatest virtue. Or, she was just a woman, her mind filled only with thoughts of love and chivalry, etc. I'm not even trying here, these are just examples I typed off the top of my head. One thing I haven't had to deal with in my novels is raging racism. I swear racism is innate to Asians who grow up in Asia, and there's no PC movement here either, so it just doesn't register how offensive it is. Add to that historical tensions between China and Japan and Korea. Story 42. Long time ago, I did a pro bono interpreting gig for a community healthcare clinic. The doctor asked me to help call a woman who had come in for a PAP smear to tell her she had an STD. She insisted it was only a cancer test and hung up on us. We had to call her back. She didn't answer the phone. Story 43. There is a service called Titai. which is used to help people who are hearing impaired have phone conversations with hearing people. Not used as much these days because people mostly just text each other, but is still used if a company or service doesn't have an online chat option. Anyway, I used to work for a call center that provided the TIEI services for my province. There used to be a couple who would call in and have phone sex every Thursday night at a certain time. It was awesome. As a rite of passage, we used to keep it a secret and put the newbies on Thursday nights when we knew the couple would be calling in. A bit of a hazing ritual, if you will. We had fun. Story 44, not an interpreter, but when I did a study program in a foreign country, we had one of the students translate the teacher's feedback to our group on a big project. Our group did our project at the last minute, and the teacher was so critical about our assignment, the student refused to translate the teacher's comments because they were so harsh. Our project was awful, and the presentation was embarrassing as hell, but I had a lot of fun in the country, so I can laugh about it now. Story 45, my husband is a CODA, child of deaf adults. He used to go to the movies with his parents and sit in between them and sign for them. Yeah, the steamy car scene in Titanic is always awkward for a young child to explain to his parents. Story 46, not a translator, but I do English grammar editing for scientific manuscripts, and much of my work is translated into English. One of my favorite misspellings is of the word analyze. Analyze is acceptable if the manuscript is in UK English. However, analyze is a whole other thing entirely. Story 47, I finally have a story to share, but it will get buried. I grew up in Mexico to missionary parents, so we would get a lot of American groups with doctors that would go to the local villages to do medical checkups. Since I am bilingual, I would be their translator a lot of the time, even though I was just like 12, 13. I really enjoyed doing it, and for the most part, it was minor issues that the patients had, but one in particular does come to mind. It must have been a lady in her late 60s or younger, but just poor so they don't age as well, that came in to get a checkup. Her problem was basically that her uterus was falling out and would not stay up inside her. I guess it turns out that after a lot of children in old age, it is just something that can just happen. Needless to say, 13-year-old me was pretty uncomfortable. Story 48, my ex was Hungarian, and his mother spoke zero English. He was about 13 when she got pregnant with his brother, and he had to interpret at all her hospital appointments. I can't imagine he was comfortable having to ask the doctor if it was okay for her to have sex while pregnant. Story 49. I started translating for my pediatrician right after high school and had a PT who went to school with me. I walked in and she was just as horrified as I was, especially after learning that she was there a yeast infection. She knows English, but her mom only spoke Spanish. Super awkward situation. Story 50. Twice. I had to have a sexually explicit encounter between two students translated to their very Muslim parents. Once it was male-female, the other was two guys. I warned the translator what I had to share prior because she spoke a number of dialects/languages, and we wanted to make sure we said the correct words. Story 51. Late to the party, but here goes 7. 8 years ago, I worked as interpreter for a major, if not the biggest, house appliance company and distributor in Indonesia. They hired me for their weekly evaluation meeting between CUU, sometimes CFO and CEO also there, head of sales department, and their branch managers from all over the country. It's an evaluation meeting. Targets, sales numbers, percentage, and all kind of performance indicators are discussed. They also discussed sales strategies and all kinds of marketing and promotion for the week month. But main part of the meeting is to scold the branch managers who did not meet their target. At one of the meeting, the CUU, not happy with the performance of one branch manager, asked, "What is your plan for next month?" And the branch manager said, "I'm focusing on next week's sales target," which replied by the CUU to all the branch managers, "All of you are idiots," which I have to translate. Now, I'm not even graduated yet from my university back then, so I calmly translate, "Kalian semua tidak pintar," or "You all are not smart," which then quickly corrected by the head of sales, Indonesia, saying, "Bukan, maksudnya kalian semua goblok." No, that's not the translation. He, CUU, means all of you are idiots. Left that job a month after that incident, can't handle the stress. Story 52. I played soccer at a university that happened to have a very large deaf program. So we attracted some of the best deaf players in the country. This one particular guy played center mid. Yay, in the middle of the field where most people depend very much on hearing your teammates pretty much all the time, as a 100% deaf person. And he still became an academic All-American, Conference Player of the Year, etc. Dude had a spider sense. Anyways, we have this Tildy 45-year-old lovely woman, bless her heart, with 20 plus 18, 22 YO athletes at all times for practices and game stuff, traveling, etc. She translated some crazy, immature, inappropriate things with grace and humor on many an occasion. But the one that sticks out was when we were stretching before a game and someone ripped ass so loudly that literally everyone looked over and started laughing. Without skipping a beat, she performed the sign for a fart, which is blowing into your thumb like it's a glove balloon. and wiggling all your fingers as if gas is passing through them, causing a whole new level of laughter to erupt. That's hilarious. But she did everything she could to make sure they didn't miss any of the joking and fun times. Great lady. Noteworthy afterthought. After the season, we got him stoned, and he could see our mouths moving and could actually hear the words, haha. Also, there are very weird noises in a deaf dormitory. Story 53. I'm a medical interpreter for patients during doctor office and hospital visits. One of my most favorite moments would have to be when this pregnant woman was being seen for her regular checkup. Her husband was with her, and they were finding out the sex. So after about an hour and a half of getting images of the baby in all types of positions, the doctor points out that it's a boy. They're all excited and stuff. Then the guy turns to the girl and they start whispering. I can hear them clearly, but because they never spoke to me or the doctor directly, I chose to ignore them. I was mortified, hoping that he wouldn't ask me to translate that because I couldn't figure out the best way to translate it so I wouldn't sound creepy. So he then turns to me and straight up asks me to ask the doctor to see his pee. So I turn to the doctor and I start stammering like, well, they'd like to confirm that it's a male. I broke all protocol at that point because we are supposed to translate word for word exactly everything that is said. The doctor looks at me and says, he wants to see the baby's pee, huh? And I'm like, yeah. And she says, trust me, we get that a lot. Story 54. Slight aside to this, my mom was a sign language interpreter. I came home from school one day, and as soon as I entered the house, I could hear my mom's voice coming from upstairs. As I walked up the stairs, it became clearer, but it made no sense. What I was hearing was my mom in a very weird monotone saying, crap, a hole. Damn, mother ducker, ducking a hole, crap stain, and on and on. It was bizarre. I sort of slunk past into my room, not wanting to get involved in whatever was happening. I should add, my mom was, and is to this day, very religious, so this made even less sense. When she did eventually come out of her room, she was shocked to see that I was home and tentatively asked if I had heard her. I turned beet red, and then so did she. She sat down on my bed and explained that she had been called in to translate for the police and at trials and hospitals, etc., and often found herself at a loss for how to translate certain things, and often found herself just spelling out curse words, which sort of takes the sting out of them, dilutes their meaning. So she had recorded herself saying every curse word she knew and was practicing translating them alone in her room. Story 55. I don't work as an interpreter, but I know a couple of other languages, and I had, unluckily, came across a distressed woman who was frantic and agitated. She was trying to talk to a cop of how she was adduced, and lots of other horrible things that some a hole did to her. So as I was passing by, I heard him say that he didn't even know what language she was speaking and kept asking her to calm down, which she didn't obviously cause she could not understand him. After a few painful seconds, I manned up and asked if she was okay, which she was relieved to hear that I understood her and asked if I could translate. I told her that I'm not fluent, but I can get by easily. I'm normally a cold guy, but damn did my heart go out to her. The officer thanked me and asked if I could be with her till a professional came, and I agreed. I did not want to hear the details, but she really let it all out. Curse words sound so wrong in other languages, I cringed. Because I could say duck you in English and it's all right, but damn, do I feel like I should wash my mouth after saying it in a different language? Story 56. I was my mom's translator when she was trying to sue her ex-boss for harassment. The lawyer wanted to know exactly what kind of sexual encounters they had, when, where, how, all the specifics. Yeah, I asked the lawyer to bring in an actual translator after that. Story 57. So at a sign language interpreters conference I did a clinic on assisting individuals who are deaf-blind. Use of ASL to describe things gets interesting, and sometimes borderline intimate when doing hand over hand. Imagine rapid facial body touches while clasping hands with someone else. Well, nearing the end of the clinic, and we're all feeling pretty comfortable with each other when the woman leading the clinic decides to relate her favorite tale. She had a client contract her for interpreting and navigation services one evening. After running some errands, he rather sheepishly informed her that he had always wanted to go to a strip club. She, being a good sport, agreed to go. While explaining what then ensued, she grabbed my hands to demonstrate her client and proceeded to show the room how she had translated what the women were doing on stage into motions with her hands. Apparently, the client had a very good time. I was a little red-faced at having essentially softcore fed into my hands in front of a room full of people. Story 58. I was called to the lab to help a patient register for, understand, and drop off his semen analysis following his vasectomy. I am a female. As we were finishing up the interaction, I asked the patient if he needed anything else. Your number. The lab has our number, their interpreter team, and can get us if anything else is needed or to call you for results. No, I need your number. Sorry, but I don't give out my personal number to patients. Q guy putting sunglasses on inside. under the fluorescent hospital lights and awkwardly trying to get out of there as fast as possible. It still took at least 5 minutes before he was done confirming everything with the lab team. Story 59. In 2016, I was working in a hotel in Venezuela when the Non-Aligned Movement Summit happened. Being one of the few people that could speak English at the front desk, I had most of the interactions with the people from the delegations. Most of them had their own interpreters, but during the night audit shifts, I had a lot of delegates from China, North Korea, and several countries from the Middle East come to the front desk to ask about prostitutes, how much they charged, and what services they provided. We were one of the fancy hotels on the island, and they were upset we didn't have a list of escorts ready to serve. Apparently, the most used service during the summit was male escorts according to other F-days I knew from other hotels. Story 60. Many years ago, an American participant in an international program that I was running in a Hispanic country died suddenly of a heart attack. His wife happened to be on the program too and was present when it happened. While we were waiting for the coroner's van, which was coming from a larger town, I thought of calling the local priest since I knew both the deceased and his wife were Catholics. When the priest showed up, he turned out to be the most inappropriate, awkward, and unconcerned person I have ever seen in such situation. He was talking to the wife with total lack of empathy or interest about her feelings. I was translating for him, and I had to make up the whole translation because I was so ashamed of the words of the priest. He would say things like, "I was in the middle of my lunch when you called me," and I would translate, "I could not wait to come comfort you when I heard of this tragedy. The whole thing was so sad." The wife was very appreciative that I had called the priest, but all the comfort words were mine. Story 61. I was translating during a divorce trial. You have to swear that you're translating to the best of your ability, just like a witness swears that they're telling the truth. No sweat. You're pretty much a machine. You just translate whatever they say. So the judge, clerk, attorneys, and husband and wife hear what is being said. Well, at one point, the accusation comes out that he was sleeping around. Well, the husband loses it and starts cursing up a storm, calling her escorts, etc. Well, I just translated what he said the best I could. Eyebrows were raised, and I just shrugged my shoulders. Just doing my job. The judge reprimanded him. The wife was testifying at the time. And the guy yells back at me asking, "What did I say?" The judge was cool and winked at me. It was awkward, but he did tell me afterwards that I did a great job. Story 62. I briefly worked remotely as a proofreader for a Korean newspaper that was working on a big tourism promotion project. Basically, bilingual Koreans would translate some spiel about "come visit Korea." Their crafty English draft got sent off to me. I fixed it up and sent it back. These articles always had wild claims like, Seoul is the only city in the world where the majority of the population lives in high-rise apartments. Or, Korea is the only country with 4 distinct seasons. This is South Korea. You would think this kind of ethnocentric bullcrap would be a product unique to the North, but apparently not. Proofreading these was so awkward for me because I wanted to straight up say, "No, it ducking isn't," but I kept my mouth shut because it was good money as a university student. Story 63. When I was in law school, I volunteered as a Spanish-English interpreter at a legal clinic that helped asylum seekers in their deportation proceedings. We had to have all of our meetings in detention centers, jails, and I often had to interpret truly horrific stories about gang violence and police brutality. Story 64. I got to voice the part of racist Nazi grandfather yelling absolutely obscene things to his half-Jewish daughter-in-law. I still feel dirty when I think about the things that came out of my mouth. On a lighter note, I made an old lady snort milk out her nose with laughter when I mixed up the signs for flashlight and coom during a church group Bible study. They're a real mix in this job. Story 65. My mom is a sign language interpreter, and she's the most sweetest pie mom you can imagine. I've never seen her take a single sip of alcohol. I'm 30. She says things like "oh dern" and "son of a gun." She told me about one time interpreting on the psych ward at the hospital. The deaf patient was throwing chairs at the doctor and signing every obscenity you can think of and many that don't even have an actual sign to them. And, as an interpreter should, my American sweet-as-pie mommy had to aggressively cuss the doctor out word for word. It was the best thing I could ever picture. I was dying laughing. Story 66. When I was about 6 months old, my mom, sister, and I moved to the U.S. My dad was already here and going to college. My mom and sister, 6 years old, didn't speak English at this point. Well, there was a lady who was learning French who was going to be taking care of my sister, and I guess teaching her English. Well, this lady wanted to call my mom to let her know that she met my sister. In her novice French, she told my mom, "I hit your daughter with my car," instead of "I met your daughter in my car." My mom staffed her crying and thought I brought my child to this country to be hit by a car. Why is this woman so happy? My mom then called my dad to tell him what happened. My dad, being a rational person, knew that no one would call and say that, so he called the daycare language story and straightened that out. Story 67. I had to listen to someone draw their last breath as I asked them what happened. I've told a man he has herpes. I've had to tell a woman in South America that the bank in the United States mailed her life savings to the wrong address and that there was nothing she could do about it. I think one of the most uncomfortable conversations was listening to a lady talk about how granddaughter was eating her own poop because of the trauma she was going through at home with her abusive parents. The worst part is that we were put on hold, and I wasn't allowed to talk unless I was interpreting, so this poor woman was venting about all of these horrible things going on with her daughter and granddaughter, and how she's trying to get her daughter arrested. It was horrible. Story 68. I'm not an interpreter, but my sister is deaf. We often hire her interpreters for events when my mother, who is fluent more so than I, won't have the time to. My grandfather passed away and we scheduled an interpreter for the funeral so my mom didn't have to worry. I could tell the interpreter was a little uncomfortable, but that she wanted to properly translate what was being said. Sometime during the service, the interpreter shed a few tears and made eye contact with a few family members, so I was ready for her to leave quickly when it was all over. But she stayed and kept interpreting. My grandmother ended up telling the interpreter that the only reason she was able to sit through the whole funeral was because she was watching her and found her signing comforting. Probably an awkward and uncomfortable experience for her, but it meant the world to my family. Story 69. I was a Russian translator for a refugee clinic while studying the language at college. It was okay because most of the time I just helped make doctor's appointments or work interviews or whatever. Pretty basic stuff I could handle. Then one day I had to take a couple to the courthouse to get a marriage license. I made it through translating pretty smoothly. Then the guy at the courthouse asked if either person had any illnesses, meaning long-term infectious type things. I only knew how to say sickness in terms of short-term colds or how to say specific illnesses. I asked the husband-to-be if he was sick, like AIDS or something. Ooh boy, the husband-to-be was very confused and offended. We got through it and they got their marriage license. Story 70. My aunt went to a doctor because she wasn't feeling well. She doesn't speak that much English, so she requested a language interpreter. The interpreter was a young guy who moved to the US when he was a kid. Anyways, doctor asked questions. Interpreter interpreted, my aunt answered, up until one question. After the doctor asked, the interpreter paused, thought about the question, and looked at my 60-years-old conservative, religious aunt and asked, "Does your git feel any discomfort?" Story 71. I'm not an interpreter, but a public librarian. I have a gentleman from Poland who comes in and asks questions related to English. He does crossword puzzles or watches subtitled movies and writes down words he doesn't understand and then comes in and we explain them. The other day, he asked what a dong was, and that was a bit awkward. Story 72. Might not be seen because I'm pretty late, but I once had to help my friend who is deaf break up with her boyfriend of a couple's months. He didn't know sign language that well, which was a reason she wanted to break up with him. He cried, and I felt so bad saying those words, even if I wasn't the ones doing the actions. Story 73. I managed Iraqi translators as one of my side jobs over there. SF killed this guy in his home on a raid and claimed self-defense. He was apparently bragging about how it was killing him instantly while they were on patrol and surrounded by a large crowd of people. SF showed up to arrest him and said he pulled out a gun, so they killed him in self-defense. Some family members were pretty pissed about it and came to our camp to protest what they believed was an execution to one of our majors. Our major, through our translator, told them it wasn't an execution and the SF guys were acting in self-defense. That was an awkward moment in a sea of many awkward and uncomfortable moments. Story 74. I used to translate in college for extra money, and one couple who hired me were trying to complete an adoption application. They kept asking me how I would answer the questions. Questions about how they would raise the child, thoughts on school activities, amounts of TV allowed, etc. Things I had no idea how to answer. I ended up translating all the questions in writing and telling them to give me a call if they needed more help. I didn't hear from them again. If I remember, it was grandparents trying to adopt their daughter's child. Story 75. When I studied abroad, my roommate, another American, didn't speak Spanish very well, and our host mom only knew a handful of words in English. I tended to be the dinner table interpreter. One day, our host mom was listing off the words she knew in English. One of them was sugar. Being an elderly woman who has never really spoken anything but Spanish, her pronunciation wasn't perfect, but understandable. My roommate started laughing and told me it sounds like she's saying sewer. My host mom asked me what she said. I had to translate that and see the look of sadness on my host mom's face. She was so proud of her English words, and that roommate made her feel insecure. It still makes me angry thinking about it. Story 76. My grandmother on my father's side only speaks Spanish, and I'm ashamed to admit I never fully mastered it. I grew up in Nye, and she lived in K, so we didn't spend much time together in my youth. Fast forward to 20 years later, I now also live in K. She had an incident where she ended up in the hospital, and with the rest of the family being still in NI, I went to the hospital to check on her and brought my boyfriend and his brother, who speaks fluent Spanish, to translate. I asked my boyfriend's brother to ask my grandma what happened, and he turns beet red and starts to nervously laugh. Turns out she had to have a mesh put in due to a UTI, but she told him, "My pussy fell out." Story 77. I worked for a while at a free mental health clinic as a therapist. I am a guy, and my client was a Somalian-speaking woman. The first session I had with her, I had a female interpreter, and it went great. During the second session, the usual female interpreter we used was out, so we used this new Somalian male interpreter. During the therapy session, the interpreter was becoming more and more disinterested in what my client was trying to say to me. The session culminated in the translator, "Yeah, she's just saying some crazy female things. You really don't need to know what she's saying." Story 78. For my first interpreting job, I had to interpret several times at meetings between the heads of our different office branches, and the two people absolutely loathed each other. While neither one of them spoke the other's language, the intense dislike they had for each other was so strong that they didn't need me to understand where they stood in the other's esteem. They would constantly drop little quips like, "He's so unqualified, a monkey could do his job better," or "She needs to go back to her own country so she can ruin a business there instead of here," while they were sitting across from each other during one-on-one meetings. It was an unspoken rule that I wouldn't translate these insults and just do my best to smooth things over in the interpretation. Story 79. I translate various legal documents from Japanese to English and translated family court reports for an English-speaking foreigner about how his Japanese ex-wife had taken their kids, remarried with a Japanese guy, and then refused to allow the biological father to see his own kids. The worst part was translating transcripts of interviews with the new Japanese husband who casually mentioned how the kids call him dad, and it would be confusing for the kids if they were to suddenly learn about another father figure, that is, learn about their biological father. The crazy thing is that the Japanese court agreed with the new father, and the foreigner father was granted a monitored meeting with his own child, but was not allowed to say who he was. That was hard to translate for a foreign father not used to the Japanese culture. Story 80. Not so much a professional translator, but a lot of my close friends, including myself, are first-generation Americans, so I've had a few translating experiences with their parents and my own. This one particular time that left me very uncomfortable was when my friend's dad asked me to translate a letter that arrived in the mail. It was an eviction notice. Story 81. Obligatory, not my experience, but my college roommate's, who was fluent in Spanish. We just finished our freshman year and she got a job at an army camp translating for the Cuban Mariel boat lift in the summer of 1980. She'd barely signed the paperwork when she was shoved into work at the clinic. A doctor thought the guy he was giving a physical to had an STD and wanted her to ask him if he had sores on his banana. So she started off with a memorable first day, first translation. Story 82. I'm not an interpreter, but I have a short story involving this. I probably posted it before. I was working for a life insurance company on the inbound customer service line. Lots of elderly people called in. Try keeping your calls short with those. Anyway, we had a contracted translation company that we would bring on the line. I got a caller who I believe spoke Vietnamese. It turned into a complaint call. Can't remember what the issue was, though. At one point, the customer went into a long rant in Vietnamese in response to something I had asked. The interpreter listened and responded with, "She said no." I tried to get more out of the interpreter, but that's all I got. I have a feeling I was sworn at in Vietnamese. Story 83. I used to do transcribing for the hearing impaired on the phone. Any conversation you imagine, I had to do it. Luckily, I didn't have to interact with either side, but I did have to listen as a third party. It was rough. It also sucked if you didn't see a movie right away, as you'd have to transcribe people going over the entire plots of movies. Ruined The Dark Knight before I could see it. Story 84. Sign language interpreter here. I'm nationally certified and also have a state legal license, so I do legal interpreting from time to time. Was interpreting for a deposition. Keep in mind there have been many meetings between this deaf client and her attorneys with several different interpreters over the course of months to reach the point of a deposition. After 3 hours of getting nowhere, the questioning attorney asks why the deaf person even filed this lawsuit. The deaf client responds, "What's a lawsuit?" Her attorney almost fell out of his chair. I thought my head was going to explode. Story 85. I answered a call where someone was translating for a deaf person. They type so the translator can talk. The deaf guy wanted one of our employees' number. I refused because the deaf guy had already stopped by the office, and we had explained to him that we couldn't disclose that info. The translator then told us he said he was going to kill us. The translator then apologized and ended the conversation. Story 86. I have worked for Illinois Department of Early Intervention for the past 15 years. From time to time, I get assigned to go for medical evaluations for certain cases, and the most uncomfortable one for me had to be about 3 years ago. The child was diagnosed with autism, but the mother refused to listen to the therapist and pediatric doctor. She cried and kept saying her son didn't have it. This went on for about 10-15 MJNs until they explained to her and her husband the future of the child and the good thing about being diagnosed early on in his life. Story 87. I was a missionary, 20 years old, working with Sea Asian refugees in California. I ended up spending a lot of time translating for folks who spoke little to no English. Mostly doctor appointments, talking with utility companies about bills, reading official documents from the INs or their kids' schools. Anyway, one woman asked me to translate for her at court. I told her I wasn't certified by the state, but she clarified that the case was against her son, who spoke English. She just wanted to know what was going on, so I went. It turned out to be an abuse trial. 4 guys, 2 girls. It was bad. Story 88. It was a while ago, so I don't remember the full details, but I once translated a message from a new husband to his wife, threatening her with divorce if she didn't go on a cruise with him to have, special relations with a masseuse he hired for the occasion, saying he'd interpret it as a betrayal of his love for her. Yeah, I really hope she found her way out of that one. Sounded like he had a hell of a lot of money and was holding it over her head. Story 89. My wife was taking a deposition, which was being interpreted from Creole to English. At some point, she caught the deponent in a lie and proved her defense of fraud. The deponent stood up and slammed her fists on the table and started screaming in Creole. My wife demanded that the interpreter translate every word of what she said. The interpreter refused to do so, as the deponent was apparently placing a voodoo curse on my wife. Story 90. The most uncomfortable conversation I've had to interpret was a worker getting fired for failing her substances test and being told she was getting sent back home. It was an overseas project and would lose her job. She was in tears and trying to justify it by telling the doctor all her family issues, but she worked in a field with 0 substances tolerance and was sent back the next day. Story 91. I speak fluent Spanish, and while visiting our family in Mexico, a man from my father-in-law's congregation came by asking me what pussy and a bunch of sexual messages meant. Apparently, his wife was having an affair online with some American man, and he needed me to translate. I didn't translate it for him, but I would confirm when he was correctly translating it himself. Story 92. A coworker was trying to be relatable and tell an anecdote to a Russian client that, in Russian, would make no sense. So in Russian, I conveyed this, and as I felt the anecdote wrapping up, I matched it up with, he's almost finished, so when I tell you to laugh, do so. Okay, laugh now. Story 93. I clerked at a lawyer's office where the majority of the clients were Hispanic, and because I'm bilingual, English, Spanish, I interviewed a lot of clients and translated some for our only lawyer who couldn't speak Spanish. The criminal workers' comp, personal injury stuff wasn't that bad, but I interviewed a lot of asylees, many female who had to talk to me, a large man, about being kidnapped, abused, or witnessing these things. Story 94. Have to share on my wife's behalf. She was employed as a legal assistant at a small immigration law firm. She had taken a statement from a sponsor and was translating from Spanish to English. The lady being interviewed mentioned a pet name of Mi Negrito, literally translated my little black one. She had a hard time figuring that one out. Story 95. I was a missionary for my church. I spoke Spanish in Kentucky, and we often translated for people, mainly in hospitals and clinics. Once we had a lady ask us to come to a doctor's appointment to translate. It was not just a checkup. It was to get a hemorrhoid removed. They put a sheet up, and we stood on one side while they removed the hemorrhoid. It was so awkward. The Story 96. So much of this stuff is heartbreaking. All the medical stuff and harsh news being loaded onto you guys to convey. I can't imagine that's what you signed up for. You blokes are heroes. Story 97. Oh, I bet the interpreters who come to my office have lots of stories they'd share. I work in family court and use interpreters for when families come and tell me about why they separated and why their position on custody and parenting time is best.